The opinions expressed by the host and guests in this show are not necessarily the views of Children's Health Defense.
Well, good morning, CHD. I am excited so much for this guest. If you look at somebody who has endured, who has sustained, who, while going through really the valley of the shadow of death, made a huge difference, even in that valley. It is Dr. Aaron Kheriaty. Welcome to the show, Dr. Kheriaty. I am such a huge fan, and I live in California. I know practitioners in California, and so I can't be more thankful regarding your work against, what was it, AB 2098?
Yes.
I dare say, if it hadn't have been for you and the brave others that stood up within those committee meetings and really made a huge difference, despite the fact the legislature would have voted for it anyway, I really can't thank you enough. Dr. Kheriaty, you were a professor in the medical school at UC Irvine, specializing in psychiatry, doing amazing work. And then all of a sudden, COVID comes around. What happened?
So I had been at the university. Thank you, by the way, Dr. Hooker, for that generous introduction. And I had been at the university really almost 20 years, if you count my residency in psychiatry, but 16 years as a faculty member. And at that point, as you said, I was a professor in the Department of Psychiatry. That was about half of my time. The other half of my time was spent directing the medical ethics program at the hospital and chairing the ethics committee, doing ethics consultations and teaching the required ethics course to the medical students. And in that capacity, when COVID came along, there's 5 UC branch campuses that have hospitals, not just UCI where I work, but UCLA and UC San Diego and so forth. Right. So at the office of the president that oversees the entire UC system, they put together a committee of critical care docs and medical ethicists. And I was on that committee, and we vetted all of the COVID-related policies that had ethical implications. And we were up nights and weekends scrambling to try to sort of catch up to this new illness. And so we did things like come up with a policy that if, God forbid, we run out of ventilators and the demand for ventilators outstrips the supply, what do we do? And at that point, we thought ventilators are going to be really helpful for COVID. It was only later that we learned that in many cases they may have harmed people. We had a limited supply of monoclonal antibodies. So again, how do we allocate those in a way that's fair and just? So those are difficult policy questions. And we wrestled with them. We came up with what we thought were reasonable policies under the circumstances. And then when the vaccine was developed, the university issued a draft policy of a vaccine mandate. And it came down from on high. And it didn't go through our committee, and there was no discussion or deliberation like we had been doing with all of these other policies. And that disturbed me a lot, Brian, because it was, first of all, it was very clear to me that of all the things that we had dealt with on the committee, a vaccine mandate requiring faculty and students and staff at the university to take a novel product that they may or may not have wanted, may or may not have needed, this is by far going to be the most ethically and publicly controversial of the policies. So why aren't we having a discussion about it? I was troubled by that. Why is it just coming down from on high? And, the implicit message was, we're basically not going to question this. So to try to get a conversation going at the university, I published a piece in the Wall Street Journal, co-authored by a law professor, Jerry Bradley from Notre Dame, arguing that university vaccine mandates were unethical and potentially that they were unconstitutional. And I targeted university mandates because universities were actually the first institutions to issue these vaccine mandates.
Right.
Later on, it was businesses and government entities and so forth, but they really road tested this in higher education at universities. Ironically, with a population of mostly young people who are not at significant risk of bad outcomes from COVID. And so then I passed that article, around the committee in the office of the president to say, hey, look, guys, there's another view on this. Can we talk about this? Again, radio silence, kind of shutting down of conversation. And then since I had gone public and stated my position publicly and people knew where I stood, folks at the university started reaching out to me. So nurses that I had worked on the front lines during COVID with every day, the nurses that had been there for decades started reaching out saying,
Right.
I don't want to take this vaccine for whatever reason. And I'm going to get fired. Students started reaching out saying, I'm not a religious person, so I can't submit a religious exemption, but I have conscience-based objections to this vaccine, and I'm going to lose my scholarship. I'm going to get kicked out of school. And I was very, very troubled by all of this. And so I made the fateful decision that, I was just trying to project ahead a couple of months to where I would teach the required ethics course to the students. And in lecture 2 of that course, as I do every year, I would stand up and talk about the foundational principle of informed consent, that an adult of sound mind has the right to decide, after given adequate information about risks, benefits, and alternatives to a proposed medical intervention, to either accept or decline that intervention, and to make that decision on behalf of their own minor children who are too young to give informed consent. That's a principle that goes back to the Nuremberg Code following the Nazi atrocities of World War II to try to prevent abuses and harms in medical research and in clinical medicine. And this is just such a foundational, basic principle that I could not understand why we were tossing it overboard. People were making the argument, well, maybe you're young and you're healthy. Maybe you even already had COVID, so you have natural immunity. Well, you might not need the vaccine, but get it for the sake of other people. But the get it for the sake of other people, that social solidarity argument for these particular products, I found that argument to be remarkably weak, because it didn't take long with the vaccine rollout before we had sufficient data to establish that these vaccines did not stop infection and transmission of the virus. So
Exactly.
I never told anyone to get the vaccine. I never told anyone not to get the vaccine. What I stood on was an ethical principle of informed consent, saying people should be given that choice. I put a stake in the ground, and I made an effort to change the policy. And I did that by filing a lawsuit in federal court, arguing that the vaccine mandate was unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment. The court ultimately didn't accept my argument, although ironically, if I would have filed it a year later, I probably would have won that case under a new precedent that the Ninth Circuit set 9 months later. But so part of it was a timing thing. But even before the court made a ruling in my case, the university fired me as quickly as possible. They first placed me on what they called investigatory leave, and then a month later on unpaid suspension, and then a month after that, they fired me. So I ended up losing my job for alleged noncompliance with the very policy that I was challenging in federal court. And I say alleged because there were several other faculty members that I met who were given accommodations to work from home, which I could have done. Already, like 75 to 80% of my work was remote. At that point, a lot of my work was telemedicine with patients. A lot of my teaching was on Zoom. So it would not have been hard to keep me on at least part-time as a remote worker. But, I like to tell people, if you want to go sideways with your employer really, really quickly, a good way to do that is to sue them in federal court. So once the lawsuit, once I sort of threw down the gauntlet, they were in no mood to cooperate.
We're so thankful that you did. And when you wrote that Wall Street Journal piece, end of 2021, I can't remember when the university mandates came down hard. I know that like the UCs really said, you will get the vaccine. I was working at a private institution at the time, and they were going to do that, but it was the nursing school that rebelled and said, no, we'll quit. And there's such a shortage of nursing in our community that they could have all gotten jobs really easily at the hospitals anyway. Who some were, allowing people to opt out. I live in Reading; it's very libertarian. But when you wrote that piece, did you have any inclination of what would follow?
So I didn't know how it was all going to unravel. When I wrote the piece, I hadn't necessarily decided to file the lawsuit yet. I was just trying to make a public case and get a conversation going. I believe that was July of 21. By August of 21, I had made the decision to file the lawsuit. By September of 21, that process of unpaid suspension and so forth had already begun. And by December of 21, I was fired. So it all happened relatively quickly in the second half of that year during the vaccine rollout.
Wow.
And, so by the end of 2021, I was out of a job. I,
Mhm.
I had planned to retire at the university. I didn't really have a parachute or a backup plan. So I sort of scrambled to, throw in with another colleague and put together a private practice so I could at least see the patients that I was treating at the university. And most of
Right.
them came into my private practice with me. And then fortunately, some independent think tanks like the Ethics and Public Policy Center in DC and the Brownstone Institute reached out and offered to support my work in ethics and in public policy and public health. Uh, so, I mean, God took care of me during that
Exactly.
period of time. Amazingly, there was just some really generous people who reached out and showed a lot of support. In fact, a month after I got fired, it was a surreal experience, Brian, because somehow I found myself in January of 22 standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., looking out over a crowd of 40,000 people. I'm there with, Jay Bhattacharya and Martin Kulldorff and RFK Jr. and the
Right.
whole burgeoning sort of medical freedom movement, COVID dissident / medical freedom movement, Jeffrey Tucker and others that I've gotten to know very well over the last few years. And I'm
Right.
standing there giving a talk to 40,000 people that are, standing out in the frigid 20-degree weather at the Defeat the Mandates rally. And I'm looking around at this amazing scene. I look down to my right. There's a marble plaque on this on the staircase, the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, saying 1964 MLK, I have a dream speech. And I'm just wondering, how did I get here? What is going on? A month ago, I was just, plugging away at the university at my regular job. And now I'm here. And the following day, I testified at the United States Senate at a hearing that Ron Johnson sponsored. The day after that, I was part of a documentary film that was being produced on this whole issue. So very quickly, in a matter of weeks, my life changed radically. And it's been a wild ride since then. I can say it's been a lot of fun. I've met some wonderful people like you, lots of folks at CHD, many, many new friends and people that I have tremendous actually respect and admiration for. So I had no idea, to answer your question, there's a long-winded answer to your question. I had no idea what would happen when I wrote the Wall Street Journal piece. I just had something to say, and I thought, well, I better say it, and I better say it publicly.
It's such an example of like when God says go, and when you say yes, the different things that can happen. I mean, because I think that there were other Aaron Kheriatys in wait. God chose you, and He may have chose others, but you actually took the step, and so to me that is, that's dynamite. When you look at that particular situation, God does promise to take care of His need, to take care of your needs according to His riches and glory, but also, he never really promised you a rose garden or, that it wouldn't be a wild roller coaster ride. So as you're describing it, it's like, wow, I stand on that. And the other thing that I think people need to know is this is built on a foundation of work that you did prior to COVID that prepared you for such a time as this. Talk a little bit about that. I mean, talk about how you feel like God prepared you for that particular moment.
Obviously, my work in medical ethics and the ethical principles that I try to adhere to goes all the way back to my undergraduate days. Actually, I ended up studying philosophy and pre-medical sciences at the University of Notre Dame and considered going and pursuing a degree in philosophy and kind of sticking with the humanities. And my then fiance, now wife, wisely advised, well, if you do philosophy, you can just do philosophy. But if you do medicine, you can do both, because you could do medicine and medical ethics and bring the philosophy to bear on that. That was very good advice. That's in fact what I did. So I went to Georgetown, where I was able not only to study medicine, but also study bioethics with a very fine mentor, a man named Edmund Pellegrino, who was the chair of the U.S. President's Council on Bioethics for many years, one of the sort of founding fathers of American bioethics. So I had a great experience there. I was able to do some research, publish a paper, and give some presentations under his tutelage. And then just continued getting involved in ethics throughout residency in my early career, and evolving to the point where, as I said, by the time I left the university, about half my time was spent doing medical ethics, and about half the time was spent doing psychiatry. And I was aware, living here in California, that there were already serious problems even prior to COVID with informed consent when it came to vaccines. And that was a serious concern of mine. I had not done really robust work on that issue, but
Right.
I had a conversation with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. actually a couple of years before the events that I described, just talking about the situation in California and expressing some of my concerns with him and some of his colleagues at CHD. And essentially what had happened in California is that they had squeezed physicians to the point where it was impossible to get appropriate exemptions and opt out of the vaccine regime.
Right.
And you could have a perfectly legitimate medical reason, either an adverse reaction to a vaccine or a family history of severe adverse reactions to vaccines, that in any sane medical system should have been an easy opt-out. But what happened in California, under basically pressure from Big Pharma, is that the system that oversees medicine in California at the state level started punishing physicians who would write medical exemptions, perfectly appropriate medical exemptions. Any physician who wrote more than 5 medical exemptions had their name put on a public list, and a black cloud then hanging over their name and their medical license. And there ended up being like close to 10,000 people on that list, which the Department of Public Health was never going to investigate all those people, never going to clear any of their names. It was just this, we're just going to cast a cloud of suspicion over you to basically silence you and shut you up and stop you from exercising your best medical judgment. And so that was a serious problem. And then they got rid of religious exemptions, which is another serious problem. To me, that's totally unconstitutional. It's a clear violation of the Free Exercise Religion Clause in the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. So I'm still baffled as to how a law like that can withstand judicial scrutiny. But basically, we've set up a system in California where you can't go to school at all unless you have the full complement of whatever it is now, 72 shots that you're supposed to get to be compliant with the CDC's childhood vaccination schedule. None of these things have been tested in combination with any of the others. Many of the adjuvants, the cumulative effect of the adjuvants have not been tested in the kinds of doses that we're giving cumulatively. And even some of the clinical trials for the individual vaccines are very, very substandard if you start looking into them. I was already aware that there were all kinds of issues with the current sort of vaccine system in California, the lack of ability to opt out, the lack of doctors' ability to stand up, raise your hand, and ask any inconvenient questions about whether or not what we're doing is good for people and especially good for children. And then when I saw that they were going to mandate a vaccine that was still only authorized under emergency use authorization, which by our federal government's own definition means it's still experimental. That's a clear violation of the Nuremberg Code. That's a clear violation of the Helsinki Declaration of the World Medical Association. It's a clear violation of basically everything that I taught the medical students. And I said, I'm just not going to stand by and watch this happen. And I'm glad that I didn't, because, yeah, I lost my job. Yeah, I missed teaching the students, but also I don't think I would have woken up with a clear conscience. And I can say, Brian, there's nothing better than waking up with a clear conscience every day, knowing that, okay, I may not have prevailed in that fight, but I did the right thing. And maybe I set an example for some other people that are in difficult circumstances that, you know, you can stand up and do this too. And it's going to be okay. You'll come out the other end of this, you know, better off than you were before. You mentioned Assembly Bill 2098, and maybe I could talk about that for a minute, because that was a legal victory. Yes. And so I'm always happy to talk about that issue. So this happened after my case against the University of California. California passed a bill called Assembly Bill 2098, which is essentially was a gag order on physicians. And it empowered the state medical board to discipline, including the removal of the medical license of any physician who, quote, contradicted the current scientific consensus on COVID. Now, the current scientific consensus is very hard to define. It's not a legally established term like standard of care. And so the effect of this law was totally chilling. And basically, it sent a message to physicians that your job is to read a script from the California Department of Public Health and not deviate from that script, even if you have questions about the public health policies that are being enacted, even if you have questions about the effects of prolonged lockdowns or school closures or mask mandates or vaccine mandates or safety and efficacy issues around novel mRNA shots or whatever it is, you're not allowed to ask questions. That got my antenna up. I've studied a political theorist named Eric Voegelin. He was an Austrian 20th century philosopher who looked at all the totalitarian systems of the 20th century. Soviet communism, Italian fascism, the Nazi regime in Germany. He said, what do all these things have in common? It turns out the common feature of all these things is not necessarily men in jackboots, secret police, mass surveillance, concentration camps, as bad as all those things are. He said the common feature of all totalitarian systems and the starting point for all these systems is the prohibition of questions. The regime monopolizes what counts as knowledge, what counts as rationality, and you're not allowed to question it. And if you question it, they won't sit down and debate you. They'll steamroll you. And if you won't shut up, that's where the concentration camps come in. That's where the secret police come in to shut you up, right? But the starting point is the prohibition of questions. So this whole law that's being passed in California that does not permit physicians to ask inconvenient questions based on scientific evidence, mind you, is totally incompatible with science and medicine as far as I'm concerned. Science advances not by dictate from above, it advances by conjecture and hypothesis and refutation and openness to new data and new information, particularly when we're talking about an illness that is new on the scene and that we're learning about it as we go.
Right.
So anyway, long story short, I and 4 other physicians filed a case against this law called Hogue v. Newsom. Tracy Beth Hogue was the lead litigant in that case. And we got a preliminary injunction against the law on 14th Amendment grounds. We also were arguing that it violated the First Amendment free speech rights of physicians. And it became very clear that this judge in the final ruling was going to strike down the law. And so the legislature saw the writing on the wall, and rather than having, their hands slapped down by the court, they quietly repealed the law after the injunction went in place. And so that was a victory. We beat back that law. And it was an important victory because there was something called the Federation of State Medical Boards, which is, states regulate medicine. So there's a different licensing board to get a state license to practice medicine, California versus Florida versus Texas. But there's this overarching entity that assists, if you will, all the state medical boards. And they had published a policy saying we should pass these kinds of laws. So California was a test case. They were floating up a balloon to see if this would work. And had that gone unchallenged in California, we would have seen similar laws, I think, in many other states, because this was a coordinated effort to try to do this state by state at the national level. So I ended up in that fight. I ended up in another free speech fight, a case called Missouri versus Biden, fighting government censorship on social media. That case is ongoing, and the government's actually settling that case sometime in the next month or two. So that'll be another legal victory for us. So even though I didn't get a legal victory against the University of California, we got one against the state of California, and we're about to get one against the federal government on issues related to free speech and getting censorship out of science and medicine.
Exactly. And I want to point our viewers to a recent Substack that you wrote on this, Follow the Scientism. I loved that. I think, when did you write that? That came out in August of this year.
Yeah.
And it's such a good, contrast between science and scientism. And scientism really does squelch open debate, free speech, and it really, and I think that you contend in this, maybe you can comment even a little bit further, you contend that it squelches science.
It squelches science. So scientism isn't even scientific. So what is scientism as opposed to science? Science is a set of methods that disposes us to be open to learning about the natural world and gives us some tools in order to do that. And it's an ongoing, evolving process where we're always opening to questioning our assumptions if we're doing science well. Scientism is the non-scientific claim that science is the only valid form of knowledge. So it's the totalitarian conception of science, right? What did I say before about totalitarian systems? They monopolize what counts as knowledge, and you're not allowed to ask inconvenient questions. Well, that's what scientism does. It says, you're asking a moral question or a religious question or a metaphysical question or some question that we can't answer scientifically. You're speaking nonsense, right? So we're monopolizing what counts as knowledge. But then we're not even doing good science because we're weaponizing science as an authoritative set of conclusions that you're not allowed to challenge. And by the way, the advocates of scientism the people in power can always appoint the so-called experts to speak on behalf of science. Right. And then those become the people that you're not allowed to question. Of course, we saw this during the pandemic with Anthony Fauci and others saying absurd things like, I am the science, and he who questions me is questioning science. So they're trying to don the mantle of scientific authority to basically dictate conclusions from on high, right, and shield those conclusions from any challenge, including challenge by scientific evidence. So scientism is not scientific. It's an ideology. And in fact, the very premise of scientism contradicts itself. That science is the only valid form of knowledge is not a scientific conclusion. It's a metaphysical premise that you smuggle in the back door. It's an unproven assumption that, scientism needs to hide from itself. And so it's necessarily mendacious. It's necessarily dishonesty is baked into the whole system, and it leads in this totalitarian direction. So that article, Follow the Scientism, tries to unpack some of those ideas in a little bit more depth.
When you really, really distill it down, and then you look at, I think the contrast there in looking at what science is supposed to look like, and the gift of a question, and asking a question, and being questioned. When you're on sort of the uphill side of, perhaps this issue, and I've been looking at vaccine adverse events and sort of challenging the narrative for a really, really long time, then, it is sort of a David versus Goliath, scenario. But watching it play out, and the way that you describe it, with some of the acolytes that have been, wanting to be trusted as individuals rather than what they say, being scientific or non-scientific. You've got Anthony Fauci, Francis Collins, Paul Offit, Peter Hotez, that have really sidestepped, and they will never debate. They will never,
that's right,
have that particular scientific debate. Now, with my last question, I want to bring up your new book, Making the Cut: How to Heal Modern Medicine. That came out in September. You've been a busy guy. I think 3 books have come out since the start of COVID, and all of them absolutely amazing. But how do we fix this?
Yeah. So Making the Cut I attempt to do 3 things. The first is It's a memoir of my medical training. So I attempt to put the reader there in the operating room, there at the bedside. What is it like to try to learn medicine? So there's a lot of blood and guts, a lot of patient stories. And from there, I try to build out what is a sound philosophy of medicine. And based on what I try to articulate as a sound philosophy of medicine, I critique contemporary healthcare. And the story of that critique is a little bit complicated, but I can boil down just a few of the features of that critique. So in the later chapters, I argue that contemporary medicine has been compromised and in many cases ruined by what I call managerialism. Managerialism is the ideology that so-called experts, having at their fingertips so-called expert knowledge, can and should be able to dictate from the top down everything that happens in society. And when you place this in the context of medicine, what it says is that bureaucrats, hospital CEOs, people in charge of Medicare reimbursements. Doesn't really matter whether the people at the top of the system are at the top of the corporate medical system or the top of the government-run medical system. The end result is the same, that dictates are flowing from the top down, and the people on the ground, the people closest to the patients, the doctors and the nurses, are being squeezed. We are getting to the point where it's really hard, because of this managerialist regime, to exercise appropriate, what I call discretionary latitude, appropriate room to tailor treatment to the needs of the particular patient, right? We become unthinking, doctors become unthinking robots going through checklists that are dictated from the outside, not always with the patient's best interest in mind. We become glorified data entry clerks staring at a computer screen, asking patients questions that have very little to do with their chief complaint and their reason they came to see us in the first place. And the system itself becomes focused more on efficiency than on health. So you go to a hospital and you feel like you're being moved through a conveyor belt, industrial, turnstile, people moving system. Like when you go to Disneyland, Disneyland is engineered to get as many people through as many rides, as many turnstiles, as many food lines, as many bathroom lines as possible during the day, right? It's a people moving operation. Exactly. Well, hospitals have become a people moving operation as well. And you get processed in a kind of homogenized way, not in an individualized way. And you often come out the other end feeling like you spent a lot of time and energy on this thing, but you're no better than you were when you first went in. So what's going on here? So that the diagnosis has to do with excessive top-down control. And then the treatment that I propose in the last chapters, I think, I'll refer readers to the book, just a little teaser. You got to read the last couple of chapters of the book to see what can we do about this. But just by way of hinting at my proposals, it really has to do with decentralization. And freeing doctors and nurses up once again to be able to practice in ways that are independent of excessive external controls. You could go wrong in the other direction as well and have no regulation in medicine. I'm not arguing for that, but I think the pendulum has swung so far in the direction of top-down managerialist control that it's ultimately it's harming patients, and doctors hate it. Doctors are leaving the profession in droves. So nobody likes it. Doctors don't like it. Patients don't like it. It's contributing to the chronic disease epidemic that we've heard so much about recently from the MAHA movement. It's not doing nearly enough to try to address and solve those problems. And so we've got to find another way forward, and making the cut is, one attempt to kind of frame the problem and propose at least a direction we need to move in. I don't claim to have all the solutions about how we pay for it, and what is the best model, for our healthcare system. I mentioned a few examples toward the end of the book, right? But I try to provide a general framework so that we can understand the nature of the problem and then understand what the right kinds of solutions might look like.
Exactly. It's a great book. It is so timely. I want to point our viewers to another book that you wrote called On Life, Faith, and Leadership.
The Tepeyac Leadership Institute, they have a series of books, kind of interviews with people, different leaders in different industries and different professions. So I was privileged to be able to do that book and share my thoughts on those things, on life, faith, and leadership.
Right. And where else can people find you?
So I'm on Substack. I have a Substack called Human Flourishing. I'm on Twitter at Kheriaty, MD. And if folks want to see my diagnosis of what went wrong during COVID, I also wrote a book a couple of years ago called The New Abnormal: The Rise of the Biomedical Security State. The New Abnormal and Making the Cut are sort of my recent attempts to diagnose what's gone wrong, first of all, with the public health apparatus in the new abnormal, and then second of all, with our healthcare system in making the cut.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, you dare ask the question, and this started just to me, it's such a journey of courage and faith and wisdom and using the ways that God prepared you for such a time as this. So Aaron, I can't be more thankful for you. I'm so glad that you were able to join us today. Keep up the great work.
Thank you, Brian. I enjoy the conversation.
All right. And thank you, everybody, for joining us for this special episode, hopefully from your hotel at the CHD conference in Austin, Texas. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great day.
We are live. So tell everyone your name first, please.
My name's Louise McGuire.
And this is about your sister.
Yes, my sister died in 2021, and I believe it was from the hospital protocol. She was given remdesivir, and a few days later she was put on a ventilator.
All right, let's start from the beginning. First question I'm going to ask you is, did she take the COVID shot?
No, she didn't.
Why didn't she? Well,
we'd been talking back and forth on the phone, and we just didn't buy all the COVID stuff that we were hearing on the news, and the lockdowns, just everything they were doing to us, the masks, the shots, they were lying to us a lot, and we just didn't believe in the shots. And I chose not to, and she talked about it. I think she thought about it from time to time, but she said she wasn't going to get one.
Okay, did she have one of those pulse readers on her finger?
She got one after she went to urgent care, and they sent her home with cold medicine, and that's all they would give her. And then she went back, breathing problems, to the ER, and they put her on oxygen for a while, and then they sent her home with oxygen and said to come back if her oxygen level dropped. So she bought a pulsometer on the way home that day. And then the next day she ended up back in the hospital, where they admitted her and started her on a treatment of remdesivir.
And who was she communicating with? Who was the person that she was telling how she was feeling?
Well, she communicated with all of us, mainly her husband, her daughter, and then we were texting back and forth at various times. And then I had my brother's daughter is a ICU nurse at the very same hospital, and so I was texting with her back and forth. And I started calling the hospital as soon as my sister was admitted, because I wanted to know about her care and what they were doing, and that's when they told me they were giving her remdesivir. And my sister and I had talked about various protocols, and the protocol of using vitamin C, D, zinc, ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, and I had all that stuff on hand. I didn't have prescription ivermectin, but I had the paste that you could get from the feed store, that I ended up taking as I was going back and forth to Roseburg. My sister died in Roseburg, and I live in west of Portland, about 3 hours away. So I started taking that medicine because I didn't want to get COVID. Everybody down there had COVID. So the hospital told me they were giving her remdesivir, and at that time I didn't know how dangerous it was. And I just thought, well, at least they're doing something for her. I asked them about any kind of vitamins, the vitamin C, like IV vitamin C. No, that really doesn't do any good. I asked them if they would give her ivermectin. Oh, that wouldn't do any good at this point. That's not their protocol. I said, well, how about some antibiotics? Oh, we don't give antibiotics for viral pneumonia, which is what she has. And so basically, they had their treatment protocol, which was the remdesivir, and that's what they gave her. And then a few days later, she got worse, and she ended up on the ventilator. In the meantime, and I had told her, I found this clinic through research that was in the same town, Roseburg, Evergreen, and they were actually treating COVID patients with ivermectin, and I had told my sister about that, but because she was communicating, I believe, with my niece that worked at the hospital, my niece was totally against the ivermectin. She thought those doctors were quacks. She blamed my sister getting sick on me talking her out of getting the COVID vaccine, which wasn't true. It was her decision. We just talked about the fact that we both decided not to get the jab. So she called me, told me she had, the COVID. I said, what kind of test did you take? She said, at home. And initially it was like a cold, and then her whole family got it. And afterwards, after a while, she thought she was over it and thought she had immunity. And then a few days later, she's like, I'm really sick. My kidneys are hurting. My ovaries are hurting. My lungs. And this is before she ended up in the hospital. And so I sent her the hydroxychloroquine I had, sent her some azithromycin. I told her where to get the ivermectin. And I think she only took a couple of the antibiotics before she was admitted to the hospital. So her condition just continues to worsen. And at the time, the hospital, of course, wasn't allowing anybody in as support or to advocate for her. And I had been working with various organizations and was involved with some people that had rallied outside of Portland hospitals to get family members to be in with their loved ones. And there's a law called HBS 1606, and that's to allow people to have advocates that need advocates in the hospital to be with them. And so I asked the people that I knew to please call the hospital and put some pressure on the hospital to let my brother-in-law be in the room to be an advocate for my sister. And so they did. Well, that really made the hospital mad, made my niece, my brother's daughter, mad at me. They were just outrageous. But they did let my brother-in-law in for a while. A few days before she was intubated, her oxygen level had dropped. He went in, he sat with her, he held her hand for like 5 hours. Her oxygen level went up. They didn't have to intubate her that day, but that was the last time they let him in the hospital until she was on the vent in a coma, and like 1 or 2 days before she died, they finally let him and my niece into the hospital. They never would let me in the hospital because they were mad at me. And my sister was in a room that you could stand outside and look in. And the day she died, I was standing out there praying and reading my Bible. And the security guard came and kicked me out of the hospital property, and I refused to go. I said, I have a right to be here. My sister's dying. And she called the police, and the police ended up...
Who called the police?
The security from the hospital said I was trespassing. I said, what am I doing to trespass? I'm standing here reading my Bible and praying for my sister who's dying. And so she called the police, and the police were nice, but he's basically forcing me off the hospital property with the promise from the security guard that she'd get in touch with the administrator and make arrangements for me to say goodbye to my sister. And like I told him, I didn't want to stand there and watch my sister die. It was horrific. She's on a ventilator. She looks like she's all poofed up, 100 pounds more than she was, normally it looked like. And I didn't want to see that, but I had the right to be there, I felt. And no, I didn't get that right. So along this journey, let me see. I contacted a lawyer, Ralph Lorigo from New York, who I had read about, who had been instrumental in getting court orders to force hospitals to allow ivermectin to be administered to the patients. And so I called him, I retained him, and he asked me to find a lawyer in Oregon, which wasn't easy, but I found one that could serve the papers, etc. So she was in the queue to get a case going. Unfortunately, she died before anything happened. And one of the requirements, he asked me to also get a prescription for ivermectin for my sister. Well, that was difficult as well because nobody in Oregon wanted to give out a prescription for ivermectin because they were afraid they'd lose their license. But I was able to get one, telemed. And then one of the doctors I talked to along the way, he said, why don't you see if they'll try Zizami, which was a trial drug that was being used in late stage COVID. You could give it through IV, and it wasn't as politically controversial as the ivermectin. And so I called the company, it made it. This is on a Saturday. He called me back, he gave me all the information I needed. to give to the hospital, and I gave it to the hospital and my brother-in-law. My brother-in-law spoke to the attending physician. The physician said he'd do everything he needed to do that this company required, and my sister should be able to try this under the right to try laws. We found out later that he totally lied to my brother-in-law. He never did anything, made any attempt to get this medicine for my sister. The day before that, we had a Zoom meeting with the hospital, and we thought we were with the family, we were under the assumption that this was to, look at her treatment and see what we could do to help her. And the meeting was only with a doctor and an administrator from that hospital. And pretty much she mentioned palliative care. At that time, I didn't know what palliative care was. But since then, I've heard it way too many times. Basically, how can we let your loved one die or kill them the most compassionate way? Is basically what it is. And so we asked them about ivermectin, about doing even vitamin C IV, high dosage. Oh no, that's not going to work. She's dying, and we're not going to do that. They just poo-pooed everything we mentioned, and pretty much we're just going to let her die. So
I just want to show them a quick picture. This is your sister with her daughter, right?
Yeah, with her daughter. Yeah.
How many children did you have?
She had 3, and 5 grandchildren. She was married. She was a loving wife. She's only 50 years old when she died. She had her own business, a small trucking company.
Oh, this is a trucking.
Yeah. She was a good sister. She was a lot of fun.
All right, carry on.
Well, I think that's pretty much.
Who was with her when she actually passed?
Her husband and her daughter. They finally let her into the hospital. And her daughter had called me and she said, I think they'll let you in because they said she's passing. And I went in, that's 1 o'clock in the morning, and no, they called the security and had me kicked out. So I sat outside with my niece's fiance. We sat outside the window for like 5 hours that night in the cold.
That's awful.
Yeah, it's awful. That's what they do. That's what they did. And my brother-in-law said there must have been 5 people that coded while he was in there. I saw a woman coming out. She was just in tears. Her mother had just died. They just took her off the ventilator. And my sister went, in the text message to me one day, she said, I feel sorry for our niece, my brother's daughter that worked there. She lost 5 patients the day before from COVID. But it wasn't from COVID. I don't think it was from the treatment.
So going back to that 2021 when Biden was standing up saying, or whichever one it was, saying that it's a pandemic of the unvaccinated, we're starting to see a pattern that the unvaccinated were purposely killed in these hospitals.
Yeah.
Targeted.
Which is really hard for me to comprehend, because here I had, not only did I have the one sister at work, or niece that worked in that hospital, my brother's daughters, he had 3 of them. 2 of them were CNAs and this one was an ICU nurse. And I'm like, how can you be so blind? And how can you be so cruel? Because I had that niece tell me I was the one that killed her because I talked her out of being vaccinated. And that's not the truth. And she's calling these doctors that are willing to treat with ivermectin quacks. And I said, by then I'd done some research on remdesivir, which is very bad. It shuts down your kidneys. And I said, well, have you read anything about remdesivir? And she's telling me, well, I didn't say it works. And I can't believe, because my sister and her were fairly close, and I just can't believe that she didn't have more compassion.
No, Now, what do you think about all of this? And also tell the viewers who you are.
This is my husband, Steve.
What do you think about the way your wife was treated?
I think it's horrible. I don't think it was right. I also don't think that the police really understand the law. Because I was there. I was in the parking lot, and they told us we had to leave the parking lot. You know, we were trespassing on a public parking lot. And no, I would just have to say that my wife fought tooth and nail for everything she could do for her sister, but she was up against a machine that didn't really care
killing
about whether her
machine.
sister lived or died. What they cared about was how much money they got, because they got money for putting her on remdesivir. They got money for putting her on a ventilator. My understanding is it's like $39,000 for putting on a ventilator, 20% on the whole bill for using remdesivir. I don't know what all the other things are because it's not getting any publicity, but they were paid a lot for the protocol that they followed. And I will say that Ralph Larigo, the attorney we contacted, we had been dealing with sort of his underlings, but when he found out that she passed, he called himself to give his condolences, and I mean he did what he could do, and I would say that the place that we went to for the Zysami, they did whatever they could do. They gave us somebody in Oregon that we could contact to get they were doing a clinical trial for this, and hospital didn't even contact them. Said they did, but we called the person. He said no, they never contacted us. It's just that
Awful. I can see it's still very painful for you.
yeah, it was very painful for us when the whole thing was going on, because we just felt so helpless. There wasn't anything. I mean, we were doing what we could. We knew that there was things that could be done, but once she put herself in the hospital, she became their prisoner, and that just is not the way it should ever be with a hospital. You know, you have rights, and our rights, her rights, were ignored, and her husband's rights were ignored, and her daughter's rights were ignored, and our rights were ignored because of this. And it was, now that I look at how everything's laid out, I can understand it better, what was really going on.
Pretty dark, isn't it?
Yes,
It's very dark.
It's just like hard for me to imagine.
How is her daughter doing now?
Well, both of them, her daughter wanted to be here. She's a single mom and she lives in Roseburg, and her car wasn't working quite well. And I think it's really hard for both of them. I've been in contact with them this weekend. They sent me some pictures, and I asked them to write up a testimony of their own. I said I'd read it if I had time, and it was just too painful for them. But the one good thing, I got them to watch one of the videos from here, and they both commented to me, that's our story. And that's why I think it's so important for people to hear this, is it is a story, and it's not just my sister that died. It's tons of people in this country that died across the nation from the same protocol. And you know, when on the Zoom call, when I asked the doctor for the list of medications she was getting at the time, there were over 20 medications, and one of them is fentanyl and morphine. And, you know, they had all this stuff that they were giving her to keep her in a coma, but it's also stuff that kills you. Especially, I looked up some of them. I could only get through part of them. But when combined, they're very dangerous. And supposedly the doctors know what they're doing, but sure, they killed my sister. They know so much.
Who is she with in this picture?
Those are my grandchildren.
Oh,
We were on I have some pictures actually on my iPad of her with her
We'll get some more
grandchildren.
for the show,
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I'm sorry this happened to you.
Yeah, me too. And
It
I'm
never have happened.
no, it shouldn't have. It shouldn't have. And it seems like it's still going on. Maybe not at such a high rate. I don't know. 2021 seemed to be a bad year.
21, 22, terrible
Yeah.
years for
Right.
people.
Isn't that amazing? After they started the vaccine rollout, the COVID vaccine, that's when they started getting all these people dying.
Doing the unvaccinated, what they did. Then.
Yeah. I believe that's true.
It sounds too much to be true or to comprehend.
Right.
That's what we're hearing.
yeah, it's hard to wrap my head around. And now I'm leery of any doctors. We lost a son, his son in June from cancer, but when we look back, they gave him huge amounts of radiation within 5 days, and within 5 days of that he was dead. We know he was probably going to die, but their treatment killed him faster than the cancer killed him.
How old was he?
He was the same age as my sister. Their birthdays were 2 weeks apart.
And did he take the COVID shot?
No.
They just killed him with.
Yeah, with
Well,
and I don't know.
Really, the problem with him was that by the time he had any symptoms, he was stage 4. He was not probably going to make it regardless. What
Regardless.
He did, but I really feel like the treatment that he got hastened his death rather than prolonging it, and the fact that they have put so little research into discovering he had lung cancer. Into discovering lung cancer early. It really hasn't. It just hasn't. There hasn't been the kind of research, and you know who gets to decide what they research and what they don't research. It's just. But in his case, once he had symptoms, he was gone in about 3 weeks, and we just. A month before his death, he seemed
To be just fine.
Very hard to cope with as well from your point of view.
Yeah. It's hard for me to understand that they've done so little to find out, to look at how you could discover that somebody's got it before they're stage 4.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Well, thank you both for telling us your stories and educating us, because this is the best education you can get, I think.
Yeah.
To each other.
Well, and the whole remdesivir thing, which I'm sure you know, but Fauci was part of the controlled study they did on Ebola back in 2015, and they had to stop their remdesivir because it was killing too many people. And then he's the one responsible for getting these protocols in the hospitals across the nation. Criminal.